Grace Thompson sat quietly in the crowded courthouse, the faint hum of whispers filling the air. It was a typical morning, but for her, it felt like anything but. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, she blended in with the others who had come to face minor legal matters. Her case was a traffic violation, nothing more than a misunderstanding, she thought. Yet here she was, waiting to stand before the judge. She had been running late that morning, and in her rush, she had missed a stop sign in a quiet neighborhood. A small mistake, she reasoned. But today, it was big enough to bring her to this sterile courtroom. Judge John Stevens, known for his stern and by-the-book approach to the law, was presiding over the session. Grace had heard of him before. He was the kind of judge who rarely showed leniency, preferring to uphold the rules no matter the circumstances. To him, every case was a test of fairness, even if that fairness often came with an unforgiving edge. Grace had heard whispers of his reputation. He wasn't one to show sympathy for those he deemed careless, and it seemed that a traffic violation would fall squarely in that category. She felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach, but pushed it down. This wasn't a criminal case. It was just a small slip-up, one she could easily explain. Still, her palms felt clammy as she was called to the stand. She made her way to the front, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Grace was used to the spotlight in some aspects of her life. She worked in government policy and often dealt with high-profile meetings. But this was different. Here, she was just another citizen, caught in a system that seemed indifferent to her achievements or who she was. Ms. Thompson, you've been cited for failure to stop at a stop sign, Judge Stevens began, his voice deep and methodical. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Grace met his gaze, steadying herself. Your Honor, I admit that I made a mistake. I was late for an important meeting and I didn't see the sign. I understand the importance of following the rules, but I ask for your understanding in this instance. I take full responsibility for my actions. Judge Stevens barely flinched. His eyes were hard, almost calculating, as he scribbled something on his notepad. You understand that this is a violation of the law, correct? It's not just about being late. It's about public safety. Yes, Your Honor. I completely understand, Grace replied, her voice calm but firm. He paused for a moment, his eyes studying her, as if assessing her words. Then, without much deliberation, he handed down his decision. I'm imposing a fine of $250. You'll need to pay this by the end of the month. Grace nodded, accepting the judgment with grace. It wasn't a large fine, but it stung more than she expected. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she felt a strange sense of disconnection. To Judge Stevens, she was simply another defendant in his courtroom. But what he didn't know was that Grace Thompson was far more than just a woman caught in a small traffic violation. She was shaping policies that could change the very systems he worked within, policies he had yet to understand, let alone witness firsthand. As she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that her worlds were about to collide. Grace left the courthouse with a quiet resolve. The fine was a minor setback in the grand scheme of things, and though she didn't have much time to dwell on it, the experience lingered in the back of her mind. She had other, far more important things to focus on. As a senior policy advisor in a government agency, Grace was involved in initiatives that aimed to reshape the landscape of public policy. Every day, she worked with a team of experts and activists, pushing for reforms in areas like education, healthcare, and social equity. While the courthouse was a place where small mistakes were judged, her work was about addressing the larger failures in the system. The traffic fine, though inconvenient, was something she could easily take care of. What weighed on her mind more was the enormity of the work she was leading. The policies she had been developing were months, even years, in the making. They weren't just theoretical ideas. They were set to transform lives. For now, Grace pushed her thoughts away as she entered her office, a sleek space filled with walls of data and shelves of legal texts. She could hear the hum of conversation outside her door as her colleagues discussed the latest draft of a new bill designed to improve access to affordable health care for underserved communities. Grace had been instrumental in getting this bill off the ground, and it was gaining traction. The media had started to take notice, and whispers of change were beginning to ripple through the corridors of government. But the public had no idea who was behind it. No one knew about the quiet, determined woman who spent hours poring over research, drafting proposals, and meeting with stakeholders to bring real change to life. Meanwhile, Judge Stevens had no idea who Grace was beyond the courtroom that day. To him, she was just another defendant, someone who made a minor mistake. He didn't know that this woman, who had stood before him with poise and dignity, was at the helm of policies that could help millions of people. Grace wasn't just a policy advisor. She was a force of quiet influence, working relentlessly to bridge gaps in access to resources and opportunities for those who had long been left behind. As the days went by, the new policies she had helped craft began making headlines. Major newspapers reported on the progressive reforms coming out of government, focusing on how they would address the needs of the most vulnerable populations. People were talking about these changes, excited about the potential to level the playing field. But none of them knew the name behind it all: Grace Thompson. Back in the courtroom, Judge Stevens carried on with his duties, unaware of the woman whose life intersected with his for a fleeting moment. He had handed down his fine, believing it was the right call. But the fine wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would soon bring him face to face with a woman he could never have anticipated would change his life. Weeks passed, and the traffic fine became a distant memory for both Grace and Judge Stevens. For Grace, life moved forward at a relentless pace. The reforms she had been working on were beginning to take shape. New legislation was being proposed, and discussions were underway in government offices about improving social services, expanding healthcare access, and rethinking educational equity. Grace was often the quiet force behind these initiatives, her name barely mentioned in the media, but her impact growing larger by the day. The new policies, though still in the early stages, were already starting to ripple through the public consciousness. Newspapers published stories about the strides being made in government, focusing on how these reforms were designed to create more opportunities for people who had long been overlooked. People were hopeful, excited for change, and as the discussions in government became more public, Grace's vision was slowly starting to take shape for the world to see. She knew the hard work was far from over, but there was a sense that the tide was finally turning. But in the courthouse, Judge Stevens had no idea that Grace was behind any of it. He continued with his day-to-day work, presiding over hearings and making decisions, all while remaining locked in his understanding of the world around him. He had no reason to think about the woman he had fined for a simple traffic violation, any more than he would think about any other defendant. After all, that was his job, handing down judgments based on the facts in front of him. He continued to impose fines, issue rulings, and uphold the law with the same methodical precision. In his mind, he was a guardian of justice, serving his community by ensuring that the rules were followed. He did his job with professionalism, but without much thought about the stories behind the cases he saw. There were so many people to process, so many cases that came through his courtroom, and each person was just another name, another decision to be made. What Stevens didn't realize, though, was that the world he operated in was changing, albeit slowly. And at the heart of that change, Grace Thompson was quietly orchestrating a transformation of the very systems he upheld. The reforms she was working on weren't just ideas. They were practical, concrete steps toward addressing the long-standing issues of inequality that so many faced. But the work was far from done. There was still resistance, still skepticism from some corners of government and the public, but Grace was resolute. As Grace returned to her work, she continued to lead with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every challenge. The fine was forgotten by most, but for Grace, the journey ahead was one that could never be dismissed so easily. She knew that real change was rarely instantaneous. It required patience, persistence, and a belief in something bigger than any one moment or setback. It was a crisp morning when Judge Stevens first saw Grace's name again, but this time it wasn't in the context of a small traffic violation. He was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee, scanning through the latest headlines on his computer. As he scrolled through a news article about the ongoing reforms in the government, his eyes caught the name, Grace Thompson, a name that felt oddly familiar. He furrowed his brow, his mind racing. Where had he heard it before? The headline read, Policy Reformer Grace Thompson leads groundbreaking legislation to address inequality in healthcare and education. The article detailed her involvement in shaping new laws that were making waves across the country. Judge Stevens blinked, the pieces clicking together in his mind. Grace Thompson, of course. The woman he had fined for a traffic violation just a few months ago. He leaned back in his chair, stunned. The realization was slow to settle in, but when it did, it hit him like a wave. Grace Thompson, the sane woman who had stood before him in his courtroom, calmly explaining a minor mistake, was now spearheading policies that were not only changing the lives of countless individuals, but were also being hailed as some of the most progressive reforms in decades. Judge Stevens felt a mixture of awe and discomfort. How could he have missed it? Here was a woman who was clearly making history, shaping the future of the country, and yet, in his courtroom, he had reduced her to a mere name on a docket, assuming her to be just another person in the system, someone deserving of a fine for a small error. His mind raced with questions. How many others had he judged this way? How many important figures or extraordinary individuals had passed through his courtroom unnoticed? His confidence in the fairness of his judgments suddenly felt fragile, as if the very foundations of his beliefs had been shaken. The article went on to describe Grace's work with a team of legislators and activists, pushing for more equitable healthcare access for low-income communities and championing reforms to make higher education more affordable. Her work had caught the attention of national leaders, and she had become a symbol of hope for people in marginalized communities who had long been overlooked by the system. And yet, when she stood before him in court, Judge Stevens had seen nothing more than a woman caught in the routine machinery of the legal system. The more he read about her, the more he began to question his own biases. Had I judged her because of the way she looked? He wondered. Did I fail to see her potential, her influence, because she didn't fit the image of what I thought someone in power should look like? A sense of guilt gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on being fair, on upholding the law without prejudice. But this revelation forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth. Perhaps he wasn't as unbiased as he had thought. Judge Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more he thought about Grace Thompson, the more the small details of that day in his courtroom seemed to haunt him. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who applied the law impartially. But now, with the knowledge of her accomplishments swirling in his mind, he couldn't help but question whether he had truly been fair in his judgment. As the days passed, Stevens found himself reflecting on past cases. He replayed them in his mind, scrutinizing the decisions he had made, searching for signs of bias. Had he ever treated anyone with the same dismissive indifference as he had Grace? He thought back to the countless defendants who had stood before him, people from all walks of life, each with their own story. Some had been in trouble with the law before, while others were simply victims of unfortunate circumstances. Stevens was certain he had tried to do his best, but now, looking back through the lens of his recent discovery, he wasn't so sure. His mind kept returning to Grace. He remembered how composed she had been in the courtroom, how calm, poised, and respectful she had been. She hadn't asked for leniency, nor had she seemed to expect any special treatment. But still, Stevens had imposed the fine, believing that he was simply following procedure. What if, in that moment, he had missed something much deeper? He wondered if the very nature of the judicial system, with its rigid adherence to rules, had allowed him to overlook the humanity of the people he was judging. He had made a snap judgment, as so many people in his position did. It wasn't that he had seen Grace as someone unworthy of respect. He hadn't consciously dismissed her, but in that moment, he hadn't seen the full picture. He hadn't seen the work she was doing behind the scenes, or the long hours she spent advocating for policies that could change the lives of countless others. He hadn't known that, just beyond the courtroom, Grace Thompson was a powerful force in shaping the future of his country. This realization was disquieting. Judge Stevens began to understand something he had never truly considered before. The law might be blind, but the people who interpret it rarely are. No matter how hard he tried to be impartial, his own experiences, his upbringing, and his worldview colored his decisions. He had made assumptions about Grace based on the brief interaction they had in the courtroom. Those assumptions, he now realized, had been entirely unfounded. His discomfort grew as he sat with this truth. How many times had he let unconscious biases creep into his judgments? How many lives had been impacted by his inability to see beyond the surface? The more Stevens thought about it, the more it became clear. He needed to do better. He needed to learn, to listen more carefully, to look deeper, to reconsider his assumptions about the people who came before him. If he truly wanted to serve justice, he would have to confront the biases that had quietly shaped his decisions for years. Months had passed since Judge Stevens first learned about Grace Thompson's role in the groundbreaking policy reforms. While the judge continued to grapple with his newfound awareness, Grace's work had only grown more prominent. She was now a fixture in policy discussions across the country, regularly interviewed by the media, and invited to speak at conferences that shaped the future of social and economic policy. Her name was synonymous with change, and the world was beginning to see the depth of her impact. Then, by chance, their paths crossed again. Grace had been invited to speak at a high-profile conference on judicial reform, a gathering that attracted leaders in law, policy, and activism. The conference was focused on improving the justice system to ensure it was fairer and more accessible to everyone, especially marginalized communities. Grace was scheduled to give a keynote address on the importance of ensuring that legal systems worked for everyone, not just the privileged. Judge Stevens, having recently started exploring how he could play a more constructive role in reforming the justice system, was also attending. He had been invited as part of a panel on building trust between the courts and the community, a subject that was close to his heart after his own reflections on bias and fairness. He was hesitant to speak at first, unsure of how he could add to the conversation, given the uncomfortable self-awareness he now carried. But he had accepted the invitation, hoping that attending the conference might help him continue his journey toward growth and better understanding. As the conference began, Stevens found himself sitting in the back of the large hall, waiting for the speakers to take their turns. Grace took the stage first, and her presence immediately commanded attention. Her voice was calm but strong, her words carefully crafted to address the complexities of judicial reform, the need for more inclusive policies, and the importance of ensuring that every individual, no matter their background, was treated with dignity. She spoke with authority, yet there was a warmth to her delivery that made her seem approachable. As Grace continued to speak about the need for equity in the legal system, Stevens felt a sense of awe. Her words weren't just about policy, they were about real people, real lives. She spoke about individuals who, like him, had made mistakes, but who deserved the opportunity to be seen for who they were beyond the flaws or misunderstandings that had brought them to courtrooms like his. He was struck by how deeply her message resonated with him. After the speech, Grace was surrounded by people who wanted to speak with her, but Stevens noticed that she was making her way to a quieter corner. He didn't know what compelled him to approach her at that moment, but before he could think twice, he was standing in front of her. She looked up, surprised, but smiled when she recognized him. "Judge Stevens," she said, her voice warm but curious. "I didn't expect to see you here." He cleared his throat, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I've been following your work, Miss Thompson. I have to say, your efforts are incredible. I've been reflecting a lot on the way I view the people who come before me in court, and I wanted to thank you. Your work has made me realize that I need to do better." Grace studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. She had no way of knowing how deeply his words struck him. but in that instant, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. And it was enough. Grace looked at Judge Stevens for a long moment, sensing the weight behind his words. His demeanor had shifted from the stern, formal figure she had seen in court to someone seeking deeper understanding. It was clear that something had changed in him. She smiled softly, inviting him to sit beside her. There, amidst the hustle of the conference, they found a quiet corner where they could talk without interruption. "I didn't expect this kind of conversation from you," Grace began, her tone gentle but curious. "You seem different from the judge I met months ago." Judge Stevens let out a sigh, his eyes distant for a moment. "I'm trying to be. After reading about your work, about the reforms you've championed, I realized how little I knew, and how easily I could have missed something important. It wasn't just your case that made me reflect. It's the bigger picture. I've spent so much of my career just going through the motions, assuming I was being fair. But your story made me question whether I've been truly impartial, or if I've been guided by assumptions and biases." Grace nodded, listening intently. She had encountered people like Stevens before. Well-meaning, good at their jobs, but often blind to the broader systemic issues that shaped their actions. Yet there was something different about him. He wasn't defensive, as many people were when faced with uncomfortable truths. He was genuinely trying to learn, to understand. And that, in her experience, was the first step toward change. "You're not alone in that," Grace said quietly. "We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. The hard part is confronting them. I know it's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, or when we've overlooked something. But the fact that you're even questioning it shows that you're open to growth. And that's where change begins." Stevens absorbed her words, reflecting on them. "I never thought I could be part of the problem. I've always prided myself on being fair, on following the law without letting emotions or backgrounds get in the way. But now I wonder, how many people, like you, I've misjudged because I couldn't see beyond the case in front of me? How many potential leaders have I overlooked? How many opportunities have I missed to make a difference?" Grace leaned forward, her expression softening. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, and to make the changes necessary, even when it's uncomfortable. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we respond, how we use our mistakes to become better. You have the ability to make a difference, Judge Stevens. You've seen the system up close, and now you have the chance to change it from the inside." The conversation flowed naturally after that. They shared their thoughts on judicial reform, the importance of empathy in decision-making, and how the law could better serve those who had been marginalized by systems of power. Grace spoke about her vision for the future, and Stevens listened, realizing that this was the kind of change he wanted to be a part of. As they wrapped up their conversation, Stevens felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known he was missing. He had come to the conference thinking he might find answers, but what he hadn't expected was to walk away with the understanding that change wasn't just something happening in the world, it was something he could be part of too. He looked at Grace, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Thank you for this conversation and for what you're doing. I think I have a lot to learn from you." Grace smiled. "And I think you're on the right path." The conference had ended, but for both Grace and Judge Stevens, the conversation they'd shared lingered in their minds long after they parted ways. For Stevens, the encounter had been a turning point. He had spent much of his life in a courtroom, believing that fairness was about adhering to rules and procedures. But Grace had shown him that true justice required more than that. It demanded empathy, understanding, and a willingness to look beyond the surface. He had come to understand that the law wasn't just a set of rigid guidelines to be followed, but a tool that could either uplift or break down the lives of those who stood before it. In the weeks that followed, Stevens made a conscious effort to re-examine his approach to the cases he handled. He began attending workshops on unconscious bias, seeking out resources on restorative justice, and even engaging in conversations with people from marginalized communities, those whose lives had often been directly affected by the very system he upheld. It wasn't an overnight transformation, But slowly, Stevens began to notice the changes within himself. He started questioning his decisions more deeply, looking for the humanity in the cases before him. He asked himself, how can I make a fair decision that truly considers the bigger picture? Grace, meanwhile, continued her work with even greater determination. The reforms she had worked so tirelessly to implement were gaining momentum, and more people were beginning to see the potential in her vision. Yet, despite her success, she had never lost sight of the bigger goal: creating a system that allowed all people to thrive. It wasn't just about the policies. It was about the lives they would touch and the lasting change they would bring. One day, out of the blue, Stevens reached out to Grace. He invited her to join him for coffee, hoping to continue their conversation. She agreed, and they met at a quiet cafe, the air between them filled with the unspoken understanding that this was more than just a casual meeting. It was the beginning of a collaboration that could shape the future. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. Stevens began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I'm learning more every day about how the system I've been a part of needs to change. But I've realized that I can't do it alone. I want to work with you, learn from you, and together, find ways to make the legal system more just and equitable. Grace smiled, sensing the sincerity in his words. She had seen many people in positions of power come and go, but there was something different about Stevens. He wasn't just talking about change. He was ready to act. I'd be honored, Grace replied, her voice filled with warmth. I believe we can make a real difference, especially if we work together. It's not going to be easy, but we have to start somewhere. From that moment on, the two began collaborating on judicial reforms, focusing on increasing awareness of systemic biases and ensuring that the court system worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. They advocated for increased training for judges, more inclusive sentencing practices, and policies that ensured fairer treatment for all. Together, Grace and Stevens set out to create a legal system that didn't just punish but sought to understand, repair, and ultimately empower. Their partnership, born from an unlikely encounter in a courtroom, grew into a force for meaningful change. And as they worked side by side, they knew that the road ahead would be long, but they were finally walking it together.